Hi everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at Maya 2013's combine and separate functions. They're a couple of simple little tools that make organizing your scenes and your objects a little bit more easy, and they can also help when you're doing things like adding materials, textures and so on onto your objects. They basically allow you to, the combine function allows you to take individual objects and connect them together into a single selectable object, and the separate function reverses that process by splitting an object into its individual components again. So I've got this rifle that I've been working on to use as an example. This object's been modeled in multiple parts. You can see here on the scope that I can select all these different pieces like this. You know, I've got rails and so on. Now what I'm going to do, you can see over here on the back, I've got these sort of three main pieces here. Now these pieces don't move independently of one another, so I can basically combine them together to form a single object, and it's not going to cause any issues when I animate the object. So generally speaking, if you've got an object like this, where more or less you would assume that the whole thing pretty much is all connected together, if the sections are kind of rigid and don't move, you can combine them together. Things like the trigger and the switches and anything that actually can slide or rotate or pivot, you can keep those things separated as individual little objects, and that will allow you to animate them. But for things that don't move, you know, like this padding here at the back, that's never going to move off here, so I can combine all of that together without it causing any issues. So let's take a quick look. The first thing I want to do is sort of just indicate here, I've just turned on the move tool. Each object that you build in Maya has a pivot point, and the pivot point basically is the position where your move, rotate and scale handles appear, but technically it's the position around which your object scales, moves and rotates, and that's why those tool handles appear in that position. It's not always the middle of the object, although you can kind of think of it as being sort of the middle of the object. The pivot point is actually the spatial position that object is in when we're talking about our X, Y and Z positions on our grid. That's the location that the values are taken from for that object. So you can see here that this selected piece, the pivot point is just down here. Up here, this pad, the pivot point's here in the middle, and for the pad here at the back, same thing again. So each object has its own pivot point, and you can see that they're all in different locations, those pivot points. So what I want to do is take these three pieces and combine them into a single object to allow me to more easily move them around the scene together. If I needed to move this rifle or animate this rifle moving, maybe it's being picked up by a character, or maybe it's being thrown through the air or dropped or something like that. Having all of these pieces combined together will allow them to all move together as a single object, and that just makes it it sort of makes it a lot less work for the animator to have to worry about making sure that all those pieces are kind of working together. So let's select those three objects. I'm going to hold down Shift, and I'm going to click on those three objects. I could alternatively just drag a box across the three, so that the selection box just intersects those three objects like that. Okay, so then what we do is we come up to the mesh menu. Now, to get to this mesh menu, if you don't have it up here at the moment, you'll need to set your menu set status just here to polygons. So this little drop down needs to be set to polygons. We can come across to mesh, and the very first option here is combine, and that's the option that we want to use. So I'll just click combine, and you can see now that all three of those objects are now shaded green. So that's indicating that it is a single object. So if I deselect and then I select again, you can see that all three pieces all select as a single object. So even though it's a single object, it's still composed of three separate shells. So there's this main section, there's this pad here at the top, and then there's the pad here at the back. So technically a shell is something that is not physically connected to another part of the model. So just to kind of give you an idea of what that is, if I select face mode and double click on one of these three shells, if I move this, you can see that I can actually move the polygons completely off the rest of the object. So this is referred to as a shell. Okay. So let's quickly, I'll just deselect that. With the object selected, you'll notice that when I combine the object like this, the pivot point for the object has now reset to the middle of the grid. So each of those individual original shells have had their pivot points basically all positioned over here. There's only a single pivot point because it's a single object now, but you can see that that's occurred. Now, where the issue with that might come in is if this was one big single part that was going to rotate, for example, when we rotate the object, you'll now see that it's actually rotating from the middle of the grid, and that might not necessarily be what you would want. You know, perhaps, you know, hypothetically speaking, you were wanting the pivot to actually occur from this location here, like this, you know, for some reason. So you'll need to be aware that the pivot point resets to the middle of the grid when you do a combine function, as we've just done. So what happens if I need to individually move these parts again and I want them all separated? What we do is select the object like this, and we come up to mesh, separate, and it separates them back into its original individual components like this. Okay, now you'll notice that the pivot point for each of these pieces is remaining at the middle of the grid. So when you combine objects, the pivot point jumps to the middle of the grid. When you separate objects, the pivot point jumps to the middle of the grid as well. So just be aware that when you do a separate, it doesn't fix the pivot point. It actually just stays in the middle of the grid. So what we can do, just to very quickly kind of reposition those pivot points, if I select each of those individual objects by holding Shift and clicking on them, I can come up to the Modify menu and come down to Center Pivot, and each of those individual objects' pivot points have now been centered to the middle of each individual object. So this pad now has its pivot point here. This section here now has its pivot point back here, and this pad here has its pivot point in the middle of its geometry. So that's basically the way that the combine and separate tools function in Maya. They're just a handy way of grouping objects together. Just as a little final note, be aware that Maya also has a grouping option which is found under the Edit menu. This is not the same as the Combine tool. Basically what this does is it keeps the objects as individual objects, but it assigns them or connects them to a sort of a position node or a container node. A little bit like layers in Photoshop, where you can group layers together in a folder. They're still individual layers, but you can kind of, turn them on and off globally by turning the group off. So group and combine are not the same thing. Okay, with that said, I'll leave this video here and I'll see you next time.